It was 2:47 in the morning when a man named Daniel Morse walked into the Harlow County Police Station and told the officer at the front desk that he had killed his wife. He was calm. His hands weren't shaking. He didn't look like a man running from something. He looked like a man who had simply made a decision and was now following through with it. The officer stared at him for a long moment, then reached slowly for the phone. Within 20 minutes, the station was full. Inside the interrogation room, Daniel didn't hesitate. He gave them everything: names, dates, a location, a method. He told them he had strangled his wife, Margaret, in their kitchen 3 nights before, that he had buried her body in the woods behind their house on Miller Creek Road. The detectives exchanged glances across the table. The confession was detailed, it was coherent, and in over 20 years of combined experience, neither of them had heard anything quite like it. They asked him if he wanted a lawyer. He said no. They asked him if he understood his rights. He said yes. Then he signed the paper. They sent a team to Miller Creek Road at 4 in the morning. 12 officers, 2 dogs, a forensic specialist. They moved through those woods for 3 hours. They dug exactly where Daniel said to dig. They searched every trail, every clearing, every patch of disturbed earth within a quarter mile, and they found nothing. No body, no clothing, no evidence that anything had ever been buried there at all. The forensic specialist called it in and said plainly, "There is no grave here." The lead detective sat down on a fallen log and stared at his radio. Something was deeply, deeply wrong. Back at the station, the lead detective, a man named Ray Calloway, started making calls. He contacted Margaret's family, her workplace, her friends. No one had heard from her in 4 days, which matched Daniel's timeline. But no one had reported her missing either. The neighbors said they hadn't seen her car. Her sister said she'd missed 2 phone calls. Unusual, but not alarming enough to call the police. On paper, Margaret Morse had simply vanished, and her husband had confessed to making that happen. But without a body, without physical evidence, without a single piece of forensic proof, Ray Calloway had a confession and nothing else. That should have made him more cautious. Instead, it made him more certain. The trial of Daniel Morse opened on a gray Tuesday morning 6 weeks later. The prosecution built their entire case on a single pillar: his own words. They played the confession recording 4 times during opening arguments. 4 times the jury heard Daniel's calm, steady voice describing how he had ended his wife's life. The defense argued that the confession was coerced, that Daniel had been awake for 31 hours before walking into that station, that he was in a state of psychological collapse. But Daniel himself refused to recant, even sitting in that courtroom, facing a potential life sentence. He would not take back a single word. His own lawyer couldn't explain it. The jury couldn't explain it. And the judge, a woman named Patricia Holloway, who had presided over hundreds of trials, later said it was the most confusing case she had ever seen. The prosecutor was a man named Gerald Fitch, and he was very good at his job. He walked the jury through the confession methodically, line by line, word by word. He reminded them that innocent people do not walk into police stations at 3 in the morning and describe murders in precise detail. He reminded them that Margaret Morse had not been seen or heard from in 6 weeks. He reminded them that the absence of a body did not mean the absence of a crime. The defense brought in a psychologist, someone who testified about false confession, how exhaustion, guilt, and a desperate need for punishment could push a person to confess to something they hadn't done. The jury listened carefully, and then they went home and watched the evening news, where the anchor described Daniel Morse as a cold and calculating killer. There was a man who attended every single day of Daniel Morse's trial. Every single day. He sat in the third row on the left side, always in the same seat, always in the same gray jacket. His name was Thomas Elward. He was Margaret's cousin, or so he told the court officer who checked names at the door. He was quiet. He was polite. He brought a thermos of coffee, and he took careful notes in a small black notebook. Several people noticed him and assumed he was a journalist. One juror later said she remembered seeing him smile faintly when the confession recording was played. At the time, nobody thought anything of it. He was just a man in the crowd. But he was the only person in that courtroom who knew exactly where Margaret Morse actually was. Margaret Morse was alive. She was hiding in a rented cabin 40 miles outside the city, under a name that wasn't hers, paying in cash, leaving no digital trail. She had been there since the night she disappeared, the same night Daniel had walked into that police station. She wasn't hiding from Daniel. She was hiding from Thomas Elward. 3 weeks before her disappearance, Margaret had discovered something about her cousin, something she was never supposed to find. Financial records, hidden transfers, a second identity, and evidence of a crime so serious that she had immediately gone to Daniel in a panic. They had argued about what to do, and then one morning, she woke up, and Daniel was gone. She waited 2 days. Then she ran. It was Detective Ray Calloway himself who finally broke the case open, but not until Daniel had already been in prison for 8 months. Ray had never fully let go of the file. Something about it refused to settle in his mind. He kept coming back to one question he couldn't answer. Why would a man confess to a murder with such specific detail and yet get the location of the body completely wrong? Either he was lying about the location, which made no sense for someone confessing voluntarily, or someone else had given him that detail, someone who didn't actually know where the body was, because there was no body. Ray pulled Thomas Elward's name from the visitor log 3 weeks into Daniel's imprisonment and felt something cold move through him. He couldn't explain why. He just knew. What Ray found when he started digging into Thomas Elward was the kind of thing that makes a detective's hands go cold. A second name on a passport registered in another state. 3 bank accounts that didn't connect to any employment history. A police report filed 2 years earlier claiming Margaret had stolen money from him, a report she had apparently never been told about. And most importantly, Thomas Elward had no documented relationship to the Morse family whatsoever. He was not Margaret's cousin. He had never been. He had walked into that courthouse using a name that wasn't his, and a story that no one had thought to verify. And he had sat in the front row, day after day, watching an innocent man be convicted for a crime that hadn't even happened. Ray called in 2 units and drove to the cabin address he'd traced through a cash rental agency in the next county, a lead so thin it almost wasn't there at all. He'd found it by accident, looking at transaction patterns near the area where Margaret's last cell signal had been recorded before her phone went dark. It took him 11 hours of cross-referencing to narrow it down to 3 possible locations. The cabin on Ferris Lake Road was the third one they checked. When they knocked on the door and Margaret Morse opened it and saw a police badge, she collapsed against the doorframe and started crying so hard she couldn't speak for several minutes. Ray later said that was the moment he understood how long she'd been holding her breath. Margaret talked for 6 hours without stopping. She told them everything. How she had found the documents by accident while helping Thomas clear out a storage unit. How she had realized immediately what they meant. How she had confided in Daniel the same night. She told them that Daniel's confession made a terrible kind of sense to her, that he had been trying to protect her by giving the police something to focus on while she disappeared. He had planned it with her. They had argued about it for 2 days before he went to the station. She had begged him not to. He had told her it was the only way to make Thomas believe she was gone. It had worked, but it had cost Daniel everything. They arrested Thomas Elward the following morning at a coffee shop, 3 blocks from his apartment. He was reading a newspaper. He had a plane ticket to Portugal in his jacket pocket, dated for the next day. When the officers approached his table, he looked up at them with an expression that Ray Calloway later described as almost impressed, like a man who had just found out he'd come second in a competition he thought he'd won. He said nothing during the arrest. He said nothing during processing. He asked for a lawyer and then sat in silence for 9 hours, arms folded, eyes closed, while outside that room, every layer of the life he had built was being systematically stripped away. Daniel Morse found out his wife was alive from a prison lawyer who drove 3 hours to deliver the news in person. He had spent 8 months believing that his plan had failed, that Margaret had been found, or hurt, or worse. He had refused to recant his confession because recanting would have triggered a search that might have led back to her. So he had sat in a cell and said nothing, and waited, and hoped. When the lawyer told him that Margaret was safe, that Thomas was in custody, that the conviction was being challenged, Daniel put his face in his hands and didn't speak for a very long time. The lawyer sat quietly and let him have that moment. There was nothing to say that the silence didn't already hold. The retrial drew national attention. Margaret took the stand on the second day and spoke for 4 hours. She described every document she had found, every conversation she'd had with Daniel, every moment of the plan they had built together in desperation. She described what Thomas had done, the fraud, the manipulation, the way he had inserted himself into the trial of an innocent man, and watched it unfold from 12 feet away. The gallery was silent in a way that courtrooms rarely are. Not the silence of boredom or patience, the silence of people who are genuinely unable to process what they're hearing. Thomas Elward's lawyer objected 41 times during Margaret's testimony. The judge sustained 6 of them. The financial evidence was the backbone of everything. Over 3 days, forensic accountants traced 17 separate transactions through 4 accounts in 3 countries, all connected to Thomas Elward's network of false identities. The money had come from a real estate scheme that had defrauded 11 investors over 6 years. Margaret had stumbled onto the documentation of one single transaction, but it was enough to unravel the entire architecture Thomas had spent years constructing. The prosecutor told the jury that Thomas Elward had not planned for Margaret to disappear permanently. His plan had been simpler, more efficient. He needed her to appear dead long enough for the statute of limitations on 2 of the fraud charges to expire. Daniel's confession had been an unexpected gift that Thomas had simply decided to let play out. Daniel Morse walked out of Harlow County Correctional Facility on a Wednesday morning after serving 9 months and 12 days for a murder that never happened, of a victim who was standing 20 feet from the prison gate waiting for him. There were reporters, there were cameras, there was a small group of people who had followed the case online and had driven hours to be there. Daniel walked past all of it. He walked straight to Margaret, and they held each other for a long time without speaking. Later, in an interview, he was asked if he regretted the confession. He thought about it for a moment, and then said, "I'd do it again." And somehow, that answer was the most painful thing about the entire story. Thomas Elward was convicted on 11 counts: financial fraud across multiple jurisdictions, obstruction of justice, identity fraud, and 1 count of criminal conspiracy in connection with Daniel's wrongful imprisonment. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When the 4 persons stood and read the verdict, Thomas Elward, a man who had sat in that courtroom 8 months earlier watching an innocent man be destroyed without flinching, finally showed something on his face. It wasn't remorse. The people who were there disagree on exactly what it was. Some said it looked like surprise. Some said it looked like calculation, like he was already planning the appeal. One person said it looked like relief, as if something had finally, after a very long time, been decided. Detective Ray Calloway filed his final report on the Morse case on a Thursday evening in November. He had worked 46 years in law enforcement. He told a colleague that night that this case had taught him something he thought he already knew: that a confession is not the end of an investigation. It is a beginning. That the most dangerous moment in any case is the moment when everyone in the room decides they already have the answer. He retired the following spring. At his farewell dinner, someone asked him which case he was most proud of. He didn't hesitate. He said, "The one where I didn't stop asking questions." Daniel and Margaret Morse never gave another interview after the first one. They moved to a different state, changed their phone numbers, and as far as anyone can tell, they have lived quietly ever since. The 11 investors Thomas defrauded recovered a portion of their money through civil proceedings. Thomas is currently serving 19 years. The courtroom on Miller Creek Road, where Daniel was first convicted, has since been renovated. The third row on the left side, where Thomas Elward sat every day in his gray jacket, watching, waiting, almost winning, is now a different color than the rest. Nobody planned it that way. It just happened during the renovation. But people who know the case, when they visit, always notice it, and they always sit somewhere else.